Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. Now, normally on this podcast, we look ahead to elections and try and give some predictions about what may well happen. In this edition of the podcast, we're going to talk about actual election results because, of course, there's been a whole slew of election results south of the border, 23 councils in all up for election. We're going to go over some of the results, what it may well mean for the way in which politics will play out south of the border. And although local elections are local, we've actually also had a rather dramatic, the closest by-election result in the post-war period in Runcorn and Helsby, which was won by Reform UK by a mere 6 votes. Reform UK, the big story in politics in the last 48 or 72 hours. Could there be any cross-border seepage? Could there be a tartan bounce for Reform UK? Well, there's a Scottish poll out this week conducted by Survation for the Diffley Partnership, and it makes very interesting reading going in to that parliamentary by-election next month in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. So before we drill down into some of the figures from the English local elections and that by-election, just in terms of your broad overview of these results south of the border, what does it tell us, Alex?
Well, I mean, I think you're right to suggest that they're amongst the most extraordinary set of local election results in particular that one can recall in many decades. The Runcorn by-election as well, I think it's not perhaps a huge surprise that Reform have prevailed there. And the funny thing about by-elections is that there is always a risk of overinterpreting the result, isn't there? Because I mean, functionally, it shouldn't really make any big difference in the grand sweep of politics as to whether Reform had won that by-election by 6 votes or lost it by 6 votes. But of course, when it comes to the telling of stories, the framing of narratives, to use the term beloved of political analysts, strategists, newspapermen, and so on, it makes all the difference in the world. These things are binary. You win or you lose. And so Reform's victory there is potentially transformational for their prospects and the way in which Reform is seen. Even more tellingly, obviously, is the number of councillors that Reform have won across England, the number of councils they have taken control of, in what you correctly suggested is a terrible night for Labour, in some ways an even worse night for the Conservative Party, which is menaced by Reform on its right, and also across the swathe of southern England in particular by the Lib Dems to the Conservative Party's left. And so Kemi Badenoch is sort of caught in a pincer trap there. But some of the results are absolutely staggering. If you look at the results in somewhere like County Durham, for instance, the home of the Durham Miners' Gala, in that sense, if you like, the sort of spiritual folk festival of working class socialism in the northeast of England in particular. And, almost anywhere, in fact, where there was once coal, there are now Reform councillors. Durham in Nottinghamshire and so on. I can't think of a more staggering set of local election results in the last sort of 40 or 50 years. But your memory is better than mine, Bernard. Has there been a more striking set of local election results in that period?
Because of course you have to compare to where you're starting from, and you're starting here from a party which really wasn't in existence last time that you had local elections in these 23 council areas. So just emphasizing the point. Reform UK won 677 seats in England last week. That's plus 677 because, of course, we didn't stand last time. So, of course, it's somewhat sensational. The Conservatives won 319 seats, down 674, utterly staggering. Labour won only 98 seats. That's down 187. I think it's probably true to say that most of the council areas where these elections were fought were not really fertile ground for Labour, but they did lose control of the only council that they were defending, which was in Doncaster. The Liberal Democrats, 370 seats. That's a big gain of 163. It builds on the performance from the last UK general election. So it rather does suggest that there was no flash in the pan at the general election last year. The Lib Dems are now back in the game. The Greens got 79 seats. That's a gain of 44. Rather interestingly, when you start looking at vote share across these council areas, it translates into Reform UK 31% of the vote, the Conservatives 23%, Labour 14%, a miserable share for the governing party. But again, many of these councils are in areas where they traditionally are not strong. The Liberal Democrats 17% and the Greens at 9%. Of course, in local government election, lots of independents stand. They take quite a lot in terms of share of the vote, so that drags down the sort of maximum percentage that the mainstream parties can get. But just giving the figures for Runcorn and Helsby by-election, Reform 38.7%, Labour exactly the same percentage share, majority for Reform UK of 6. The Conservatives are way down to 7.2%, and the Liberal Democrats have lost deposit. In terms of vote share, Reform up, Labour down by 14.2%. Now, whilst this is bad, because by-elections are really only reportable in terms of who wins, as you correctly say, Alex, but a decline in vote share of 14.2% for a party of government which is not popular isn't actually catastrophic. The result's bad because it's a lot, but in terms of vote share falls in by-elections for governments, that's not all that large. Interesting, and here is an interesting statistic, the turnout in that by-election was 46.2%. Now, it'll be interesting when we get to the Scottish by-election whether or not it will get over 40%, because turnout sometimes in Scottish by-elections dip below 40%. So the picture is absolutely clear. Reform UK are the big winners. And what it tells you is that the traditional big two beasts of UK politics, Labour and the Conservatives, are in big trouble. And what it tells you is that they're going to have to go back to the drawing board to ask themselves, how do we deal with the Reform UK threat? So let's first of all, Alex, take the Conservatives. Well, let's take the Tories first, because as Professor Sir John Curtis was making the observation, they're a threat to both the major parties. They are slightly more of a threat to the Conservatives than Labour, but they're a threat to both of them. If the Conservatives cannot deal with Reform UK, or more specifically, Kemi Badenoch can't deal with Reform UK, she will not lead them into the next election.
No, well, I think the odds on her leading the Tories into the next election have lengthened significantly in the aftermath of these elections. I mean, Kemi Badenoch has struggled to cut through at all. I think that the message from this election, these election results in England, obviously, is that, as you say, a sort of plague on both houses as far as voters are concerned. They are distinctly unimpressed with how Keir Starmer's government has done in its first 10 months in power. One of the things that is quite clear, I think, is that the winter fuel allowance cut has cut through. It's one of the few things that anybody, and indeed everybody, can say Labour have done, and it is deeply unpopular. And that obviously stands regardless of whether one thinks it was a sensible or prudent or respectable policy decision. It's one that has backfired enormously on Labour. But if the Labour Party is unpopular, the Conservative Party still hasn't been forgiven for its misdeeds in the 14 years in which it was in power. And that, I suppose, is the message for Kemi Badenoch, that it is still, as we've said before, I think, too soon for any Conservative Party leader to be really given a voice, given a platform, given a hearing by the electorate at the current moment. And I think that is the case, whether it's Kemi Badenoch leading the Conservative Party, or whether it's Robert Jenrick leading the Conservative Party, or James Cleverly leading the Conservative Party. I don't think it matters, because the public hasn't forgiven and it hasn't forgotten the Conservative Party's misdeeds under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss in particular. And it will be, I think, the Conservatives have a lot more time to spend on the naughty step, if you like. And so they're just going to have to lump it. I don't see that there is any obvious way out for them, because, as you also said, it's not just the threat from reform on the right. So you have people like Jenrick who are suggesting, well, we need to come to some sort of accommodation, do some sort of deal with reform, or at least with reform's agenda, to protect ourselves against them. But the difficulty with that is that what you would gain, if you like, on the reform swings, you would lose on the Liberal Democrat roundabouts, because, again, it was one of the underplayed stories of last year's general election was the Lib Dem recovery to 72 seats in the House of Commons, and now again, very striking gains in councils across what were once Tory heartlands, places where the Conservative Party would expect to weigh the vote rather than just count it, and so for the Conservative Party, it is in deep trouble for the time being. I don't think it has to be ruinous. But, it is just as well for the Conservative Party that the next general election to the House of Commons is several years away.
Yeah. Interestingly, when you look at the vote share and then the seat share under a first past the post system, this was really very demonstrated at the general election last year, where Starmer got that absolutely overwhelming landslide on the basis of a vote share in the mid-30s, again, the vagaries of the electoral system. Reform took 31% of the vote last week, but got 41% of the seats. And I think that the fascinating thing for the next UK general election, and this could also be a dynamic at the Scottish election on the 7th of May next year, but we'll come on to talk about that later, is that if you've got lots of parties splitting the vote, then someone that can hurple to the mid-30s in vote share can almost, even in a proportional situation, almost start defying the logic of the electoral system. Now, there have been all sorts of, and these projections are always entertaining to watch in graphic form, that Nigel
Well, the sort of
Farage,
national vote share type thing, the implied general
Nigel
election
Farage
result.
will be the Prime Minister. There will be an overall Reform UK majority in the House of Commons of 100 and whatever it is. This is all greatly amusing. It keeps people in television studios chuckling along, and gives them something to talk about when there's still 2 hours to off air. It's not happening, in my view. Nigel Farage will not be the Prime Minister of the UK after the next election, because local election results, like by-election results, allow voters to let off steam. They allow them to register a protest. There is a world of difference between registering a protest and electing a government. And the other consequence of these results is that whereas I suspect a lot of the mainstream media view is that Reform add a bit of colour to the reportage of politics, and it's all quite interesting, and they're a good talker, because of where they now are, they have to be taken seriously in terms of their policies may well be enacted at some stage, and therefore they will come under, I think, the same scrutiny that the larger parties come through. And I think that this is where there may well be difficulty ahead for Reform UK, because at the end of the day, it is one thing voters letting off steam predominantly on the issue of immigration, buying into the narrative that somehow Reform UK are anti-establishment. I mean, I find that a joke. I mean, Farage's establishment as they come, by education, by background, by employment, by wealth, by housing. I mean, my God, they don't come much more establishment than Nigel Farage. But nevertheless, voters have bought into this. And the problem for the Tories, and you absolutely nail it in one, they have been outflanked on the right by Reform. And for those Tories who are socially liberal, there is now a home within the Liberal Democrats. But there's also problems for Labour, because the people who are peeling off are working class people in traditional Labour heartlands. And I suspect it's because they look at Labour and they say it's no longer a party of the working class. It looks London-centric, it's metropolitan, it has lots of people in sharp suits and sharp dresses, with accents that are miles away from the communities in which we live. How they get themselves out of this particular hole, I know not, but I do think it's a bigger conundrum for the Tories than it is for Labour.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing I think that's worth taking note of is not just the number of seats that Reform won last week across England, but the number of seats, council seats, council wards in which Reform came second. And there are a huge number of those as well, which I think again reinforces the sense that this was if you like, almost a cry of despair and a howl of rage from the electorate that sort of transcended differences or boundaries of class and geography, because you see it all across England, and that's why I think it also strikes me as problematic in some ways to read too much meaning into this, because it doesn't strike me as convincing that you take Reform, which is a party of the hard right or the far right, if you prefer, and assume that its gains mean that voters across England, particularly as you suggest in working class areas and so on, have suddenly become enamored with some kind of quasi crypto minor milquetoast fascism, as epitomized by Nigel Farage, which is one way of reading the results, and one that people on the, if you like, the affluent liberal left are particularly keen to read it that way, and the SNP are very happy for us to read it that way. I think it's important and fair to note the suggestion that England is turning Farageist is something that the SNP are quietly delighted about in political terms, because it allows them to draw a contrast between, as they see it, if you like, the established political culture north of the border that is diverging once again, as they put it, from the political culture south of the border, and it does so to such an extent and with such extremes, if you like, that it no longer makes sense for Scotland and England to be part of the same nation state. And you see the SNP effectively talking up the prospect of Prime Minister Farage on social media and so on for precisely that purpose. It's the same line, obviously, that we heard from in terms of Brexit and Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, this time with Nigel Farage as the sort of circus master. And whether this proves effective in Scotland remains to be seen, but it's obviously a familiar SNP tune. But the big story is this sense of the depth of disillusionment with the established parties. And again, one can see comparisons with that in elections in other Western countries in recent times, even though this was, as I say, only local elections. So we shouldn't over-interpret them, but at the same time, the meaning of these elections are quite clear and so on, which is the government at a national level has to take steps to deliver, and that means delivering on economic growth first and foremost, it seems to me. And if you can do that, then lots of other things take care of themselves, in the same way as delivering on the National Health Service, reducing waiting lists and so on, does a lot to alleviate the disillusionment with which many people currently view politics. And so again, I don't think that you take on Reform myself by saying, here are Reform's policies, here are why they're wrong. You address the conditions in which Reform thrive, which is more easily said than done, of course. And it is just as well for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and other members of the cabinet that they have a long period of time before the next general election. That, of course, is very different from the situation north of the border, where, as you said in the beginning and so on, we are now literally just 1 year away from the next Holyrood election.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that what you're saying there, in essence, is that in terms of the challenge that Reform UK has for both Labour and the Conservatives, there is an obvious way out for Labour if you start delivering an economic growth, if you make some headway in terms of reform and improvement in public services and people start to respond. By the next election, the winter fuel payment axing will be but a distant memory. And because you're electing a government, there is always a slight incumbency factor where people do tend to say, better the devil you know than the one that you don't. So I can see, in a sense, a way back for Labour. I don't really see much of a way back for the Conservatives. But of course, they're called Reform UK. They're not called Reform England, despite the fact that they're probably the closest thing that you have to an English national party. But they're called Reform UK. So they are, in that sense, a unionist party. And one of the things which, again, will get scrutiny. It may well even get scrutiny during the forthcoming Holyrood by-election. Now, I have to confess, I haven't delved deep into Reform UK's website to look at what policies they have for Scotland. But if we look, if we look at
Nor have they.
if we look at the forerunner party, UKIP, in terms of their view, they too were a unionist party, but they, for example, believed that the Barnett formula should be abolished. It was one of the key planks that UKIP used to fight Scottish Parliament elections on. And that's the kind of thing, of course, that if you abolish the formula overnight, then the identifiable public expenditure gains which Scotland have per head of population compared to the rest of the UK start to go. So if
although Barnett, just on that and so on, I think it is worth pointing out that abolishing the Barnett formula is currently SNP policy as well, not just in terms of independence, but if you think back to Shona Robertson's
assigned
letter,
revenues,
demanding full fiscal autonomy, and so well that involves scrapping the Barnett formula too. They don't talk about that very much for obvious reasons.
There is no proposal from the current Westminster government to abolish the Barnett formula. The problem that Reform UK will have in a Scottish election situation is that if they continue to maintain that as their policy, then the obvious question is, where are you going to be cutting? Because you'll be making huge cuts to public expenditure should that scenario come to pass. But that sort of, in a sense, takes us on neatly to the Scottish situation, where we have a poll this week. It was conducted by Survation, well-known pollsters, for the Diffley Partnership. And the Scottish poll, and this is in line with other polls, has on the constituency vote for the Holyrood election, which of course comes on the 7th of May next year, the SNP on the constituency vote, 36% of the vote. On the list, they're polling at 28%. Labour on the constituency vote, polling 22%. Also polling 22% on the list. The Conservatives polling 13% in the constituency vote, 16% in the list. And Reform UK, we're told that this kind of politics has no traction in Scotland. Scotland, the centre of gravity is much more to the left. There is no way that Scotland will ever embrace an English nationalist party. Well, the poll findings by Survation on the constituency, Reform UK 14%, and on the list 12%, all of which means that quite a number of people in Reform UK, should this poll be translated into an actual election, are heading for Holyrood, and probably about a dozen of them. First of all, I would say that, and I just base this upon hunch, in terms of, you look at the news agenda, you look at the Holyrood agenda, you look at some of the trends. That poll to me feels about right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And again, it's not an outlier as well. Other polls that we've had in the last couple of months have suggested, similar outcomes. And I think if you put those numbers through, the great sort of computer and so on, you end up with a situation where, the SNP on 36% of the vote end up with around 56, 57 seats. So that's down, 7 from what they got last time, but is clearly enough to leave them as by far the largest party. And indeed, although the numbers might just about be there for there to be some sort of super coalition to shut the SNP out of power, in reality, in practical terms, it would be extremely unlikely for any such thing to actually happen. And so, the SNP would be returned to office for a third decade in power, which, is remarkable in one sense, in terms of defying the sort of political gravity and the old truisms that time catches up with all governments. But I suppose one of the other things is that can be true. And it is also the case that on 36% of the vote, the SNP is not the force it was, when it was winning elections with between 45 and 50% of the vote. So although John Swinney has both steadied the SNP ship in the year since he became First Minister, there hasn't been any great recovery in the SNP's own polling fortunes. They've gone up 2 or 3 points maybe. But what there has been, obviously, is a collapse in Labour, where you have a lot of people who voted Labour quite happily last July to get rid of a Conservative government, but who are now unimpressed by what Labour has done in government, and so they're not necessarily returning to the SNP, although some are, but they're quite happy to flirt with reform or not to vote at all or whatever. And so you end up with this situation where you would have a rainbow parliament, Bernard, once again, rather as we did in 2003, when the Greens made their breakthrough, when the Scottish Socialists made their breakthrough, and to some extent Reform, although they have a very different worldview from the Scottish Socialists of Colin Fox and Tommy Sheridan, people like that. But in a certain respect, I think you could say, couldn't you, that they fulfill a similar role in the electoral landscape now as being a place of a repository for disillusioned voters and so on, who are unimpressed with the SNP's record in government, but are also unimpressed by Labour's record in government at a UK level, and are not minded to forgive the Conservative Party for its record in government over the last 14 years. And so that leaves Reform as one of the few places for them. And again, if you dig into some of the numbers in that poll, it's very, very interesting when you look at how Reform does particularly well in working class areas of Scotland, that it is a much more working class party than it is middle class party. And where you look at where Labour has to make up ground on the SNP. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is, again, the subsamples are relatively small, so they have to be treated with a degree of caution because the margin for error and so on obviously becomes much greater. But it is interesting to note how strong the SNP remains with, say, people who rent their houses privately, and particularly with people who rent their houses from councils. The SNP continues to have more than 50% support of people who live in council houses, whereas Labour's support there, I think, is down around 15 to 20%. And that, it seems to me, is where Anas Sarwar really has to make up ground. And if he can't make up ground in that subsample of the electorate, then I think his prospects are really quite grim.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point to the second Scottish Parliament election in 2003, where there was a large group of Scottish Socialists, a large group of Greens. There was even a pensioners MSP, the late John Swinburne, who won on the Central Scotland list, I think it was, for the Scottish Senior Citizens Unity Party. So there were examples of people making a breakthrough. The difference, though, between 2003 and what we may well get after the 7th of May next year is that Labour and the Liberal Democrats in that parliament could still cobble together a coalition government. It may well be, the way that the arithmetic falls, that two parties cannot get over the line in terms of 65 seats, and it would be a very, very loose coalition or a confidence and supply arrangement where if the SNP are the largest party, they would need the support of not one party in the parliament, but two parties in the parliament. But I think that what we are seeing, and rather than getting hung up in one poll, what we always say when we discuss these things is the trend that's important. And I'm just looking at all of the opinion polls in Scotland since January of this year. The percentage share of the vote for the SNP in all of these polls, 35%, 34%, 34%, 35%, 36%. The trend there is absolutely unambiguous and it's clear. Labour have gone 18%, 20%, 23%, 14%, 22%. The Lib Dems appear to be going up. If we look at Reform UK, again, from the beginning of the year, we're going 14%, 13%, 17%, 12%, 14%. So it is always easy for any politician who doesn't like a poll to rubbish one poll. It is much more difficult to rubbish a trend. The trend is absolutely clear since the beginning of the year. The SNP are out in front. They're well out in front. They're averaging in the mid-30s, down from where they were last time, but on a share of the vote which is going to comfortably make them the largest party. And for those who simply want to poo-poo the idea of reform, They're polling well over 10% in every opinion poll. And all of these polls have been taken before those English local election results, before Runcorn and Helsby. So we have to look at the possibility that if that's the baseline of support, somewhere around sort of 14%, there may well be a kick as a result of what happened last week. And that is why people are right to entertain the idea that they could be in the running for second place in that parliamentary by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. If these polls are broadly correct, the result in that by-election will be that the SNP will win it, that Labour will come second, and Reform will come third, with the Tories probably absolutely nowhere. Also, I think interesting just to make the point, since I haven't mentioned them again, this is the polls from the beginning of the year. Alapa, 2%, 2%, 1%, 3%, 1%. Kenny McCaskill calling for cooperation with the pro-independence parties in order to drive home a pro-independence message next year. There is absolutely no way that the SNP will play ball with Alapa, because Alapa have absolutely no electoral traction, or according to the polls, have no electoral traction next year. So
No, Alba Bernadette, they're a party for people who love Alex Salmond and hate Nicola Sturgeon, and believe in independence. Well, in different ways, obviously, both Mr. Salmond and Ms. Sturgeon are departing the political scene. And so the relevance for Alba becomes sharply reduced in those circumstances, I would suggest. And it is very difficult to see how an Alba party that couldn't make any kind of breakthrough with Alex Salmond as its figurehead can do so without Alex Salmond involved. And the broader story again, I suppose we go back to this thing, Son. If you are unhappy with the performance of all three parties that have been in government one way or another over in recent years, the SNP, the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party, then you effectively have three choices at the election. You can vote Liberal Democrat, you can vote Green, and I would expect there to be an increase in the number of Green MSPs in the next Parliament, and the current polls suggest that they could go up to maybe 10 MSPs, or of course you can vote Reform. And Reform again serves as a kind of catch-all base for people's disillusionment, and that's why I think it is a mistake to look at Reform in terms of policy. I couldn't tell you very much about Reform's, if you like, bespoke Scottish policies, and I don't think people in Reform could tell you either. And the very last thing that Reform actually needs in terms of Scottish politics is a suite of bespoke Scottish policies and so on, because you can then be criticised for that and so on. And the point of Reform isn't to advance a particular set of policy ideas, really, so much as it is to be a vehicle for that sort of disillusionment, the scunnered vote. And that is where, if you like, having a degree of ambiguity about what Reform actually stands for is very much in its own interests. And I don't think it's a surprise that you see on a number of issues, particularly economic issues, and so on, Nigel Farage beginning to talk a little bit less like a city stockbroker, and beginning to talk a little bit more in the language of working class voters in the north of England, and by extension, in West and Central Scotland as well. That doesn't mean that he'll necessarily pick up a huge number of those voters in Scotland, but Reform's language on economics has moved to the left a bit, to take account of the type of voters it's winning in the north of England in particular.
Yeah, and as we approach the Scottish Parliament election, they will have to say something, because they will have to have a manifesto launch. And sometimes, and again, we have UKIP to go on here, and I remember a couple of elections where I sat down for a half-hour interview with the then sort of de facto Scottish leader David Coburn,
who won a seat in the European Parliament,
who won a seat in the European.
People sometimes forget.
Who won a seat in the European Parliament, and these interviews turned out to be comedy gold, really, when it became absolutely clear that they'd done absolutely no work and absolutely no research, and had cobbled together a manifesto which was no more than a set of headlines and a sort of wish list of priorities. Nothing was properly costed. But it didn't really matter, because they weren't going to win any seats in the Scottish Parliament at that particular point. But they're going to have to get their act together on that. I mean, and I will simply make this observation based upon poll results. When and you know the reporting of elections is also quite important. Leaders' debates are quite important. In terms of Scottish leaders' debates, of course, you'll have the SNP, Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats. You will also have the Greens. STV traditionally don't have the Greens on for leaders' debates at Westminster elections because they decide not to fight a lot of the seats. They don't start with any MPs, etc., etc. But if you go by the guidelines, the Ofcom guidelines, and are executing them in a leaders' debate, I can tell you there is absolutely no way that any of the mainstream broadcasters can cut out Reform UK based upon these poll ratings. And of course, we will have a parliamentary by-election to go on, because in terms of defining what is a major party for the purposes of participating in these kind of programs, you're specifically guided towards opinion polls and actual election results. So based upon that, Reform UK are going to be in these leaders' debates for the Holyrood election. And that is why they will need to get their act together in terms of policies, which, whether or not people agree with them or disagree with them, they're going to have costed and they're going to have to argue for. Because
that's going to be a problem for them.
That will be a problem. Well, it will be a problem for them because the difficulty that they have had traditionally north of the border, I mean, just being brutal about it, they don't have a Nigel Farage. They don't have a Lee Anderson. I mean, some of the people that they have south of the border, whatever you think of them, whatever you think of their politics, and you may well think their politics are horrible and all the rest of it, they are political communicators. And they've never had a political communicator north of the border. They should be going out and looking for one, would be my advice to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But even in terms of TV debates and so on, you know, their core message basically is the Peter Finch message from Network. You know, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And throw open your windows and roar that into the street is essentially what Reform are encouraging people to do. And there are plenty of people and so on in Scotland who are mad as hell and not prepared to take it anymore as well. And they don't view Reform, it's quite clear, and the polling demonstrates this, I think, they don't view Reform as being exactly the same as UKIP or exactly the same as the Brexit Party. You know, UKIP's ceiling in Scotland was always very low for the obvious reason that it was perceived as an English nationalist party. And that is a difficult pitch to make to the Scottish electorate. Reform, whether people like it or not, and so on, is not seen in quite that way. And as a result, you know, Reform has the opportunity to thrive in Scotland to a degree that neither UKIP nor the Brexit Party ever really could. And so when it comes to the by-election in Hamilton, you suggested, you know, an SNP hold, and I think I'd agree with that. I would not be at all surprised if Reform end up coming second, despite the fact that, you know, the Labour Party is devoting enormous resources to this by-election campaign, huge numbers of activists and ministers and so on pouring into the seat every weekend. But, you know, I think in the current climate, one should not be shocked or even necessarily surprised if Reform become a pretty good second in that by-election.
Yes, and that by-election, although it's for the Scottish Parliament, does give people the opportunity to protest not against the record of one government, but of two governments, and
all of them, plague on all houses, hate you all,
a plague on all your houses. I mean, this again is one of the issues of politics. Although it's a Scottish Parliament by-election, and although it should be fought on the health service, education service, the record of the SNP in government, and so on and so forth, you can't dictate to the voting public what issues they get fired up about. And you're right, a political movement, and perhaps Reform is more of a movement than an established party, that has an insurgent message, which is effectively a two-fingered job to the government in Scotland and to the government at Westminster.
I think you may be overdoing it on the finger front there, Bernard. You know, I think it may be a one-finger job.
Well, yes. Yeah, well, let's try and keep it clean at this time of the morning. No, but I do think that there will be massive amounts of protest. And of course, it would also be important not to read too much into one by-election. But let me put it this way. If the SNP hold the constituency and Labour fail to win the constituency, given that they need only a swing of 6%, and given that in South Lanarkshire, Westminster constituencies at the general election last year, they were averaging swings of 18%, what we can conclude from that, and it would not be over-analysing it, is that John Swinney has indeed steadied the ship, but the polls that we've had in Scotland since the beginning of the year are broadly correct, and that Keir Starmer has done a very effective job at digging Anas Sarwar's electoral grave.
Absolutely. And well, that's something that we will obviously continue to investigate in the weeks and months ahead. That feels like quite a good stopping point for this episode. Next week we have John Swinney announcing his programme for government with a year to go to the next Holyrood election. And, normally this would take place in the autumn, but he's brought it forward. And so it would be interesting to see what sort of bills we have lined up, what sort of agenda the SNP is going to pursue over the next 12 months, not just in terms of securing another term in office, but actually what it is going to do in terms of, the NHS, education. Are there going to be any big bills, big ideas? What is John Swinney for beyond being a steady hand on the tiller? And that is something that I think it's reasonable to say that John Swinney has been a success in his first year in doing that. But, what is Swinneyism? Is there such a thing as Swinneyism? And that is something that perhaps will become a little bit clearer next week, as we have, 12 months to go before the next election. So the election starting pistol has effectively been fired now.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And as we've said before, I think it's already clear how the election will go next year. Swinney's pitch will be, I'm not Keir Starmer, and Sarwar's pitch will be, I'm not John Swinney. God alone.
His pitch will also be, I'm also not Keir Starmer, the way things are at present.
God alone knows what Russell Finley's pitch will be. But as we've said, I think we are not only heading towards a rainbow parliament, but perhaps one where not even two parties can cobble together the magic number of 65 in order to ensure that legislation will go through without needing to cobble together further arrangements with other parties. But that's all for another day. But from this edition of the podcast, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.